Welcome to Gemara Markings. Today's Shiur is Sucah Daf Tes Vov. Today's Shiur opens at the very top of Daf Tes Vov at the Mishnah. Before we actually learn the Mishnah, we will like to take advantage of the illustration found in the Pirush Chai, the book of illustrations we've been using since the beginning of our Masechta Sucah. You'll find an illustration on page 42, illustration number 208. What we see there is a structure, if you will, we can call it a house, and it had you see the roof is made of rafters, and it was covered with a layer of cement, ma'aziva, clay or cement, some type of, we'll call it roofing material. Now, obviously, one cannot sit in his house during Sukkot to fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah. Basukkah's Teish V'Shivas Yomim, the pasuk says you shall dwell in a sukkah, and the understanding is in a sukkah and not in a house. So it can be assumed that if one were to spend Sukkot in a house, so he is violating the Torah precept, a din deoraisa. So a house midoraisa does not qualify as a sukkah. Certainly, if the house is covered with with material in addition to the rafters, but covered with cement, that's not kosher as a sukkah. What happens though if the cement material peels away and you're left with the rafters, or as you can see in the picture, it was constructed as a house, but now you want to use it as a sukkah. So there are a couple of issues that we've learned in the past that we want to note now. One topic or one concept is ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. That means when a sukkah is made, it shall be made as a sukkah, meaning that the schach is put on. When it's put on for the purpose of creating shade. And obviously it's constructed, but not as a house. In a case where you have a house which is not a sukkah, it's a house, and the roofing material peels away, and you're left with rafters. Now, rafters in and of themselves represents material that would be acceptable as schach. However, when this structure was created, it was built as a house. Now that the roofing material, or the cement, peels away or is lacking, so we would have a problem of something that was not made as a sukkah, but now it looks like a sukkah. So that represents a doraisa problem of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. You shall make it as a sukkah, not something that was made as something else, and now it appears as a sukkah. I hope that point is clear. It's made as a sukkah, but not something that originally was made as something else, and now appears as a sukkah. So in order to solve that problem, we will have a Mishnah that deals with it. There's another problem that is worthy of mention, and that's the problem of Gzeras Tikra. And we've learned that in the past as well, and that's a Machlokes Tanoim, whether there is such a thing as a Gzeras Tikra or not. And we've learned this, as we say, in the past. We've seen a Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir on the topic, and under that we've seen a Machlokes Rav and Shmuel and how to interpret the Machlokes Tanoim between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Suffice it to say, there exists an opinion, or we can say opinions, that there would be a problem in using as your sukkah covering boards that have a 4 tefach width to it. A 4 tefach width board is a board that's we'll call standard size building material. Now, as far as midoraisa, you can take a 4 tefach wide board and put it on top of your sukkah as schach. However, since it looks like standard building material where people use it for building houses, so it was felt that it should not be used. Midarabanan, don't use rafters or boards of that size, because people could come to think that, well, if I can sit in a sukkah with boards over my head of that size, I might as well sit in my house also. That is a din derabanan, gzeiras tikra. So we're mentioning these ideas that we've learned in the past, but they have relevance to this sugya. Before we go into the text itself, we have on the side a nosei nivneh heading, where a diamond is featured, and we've written machlokis Rabbi Yehuda of Rabbi Meir. We're going to see a machlokis between them, b'hachshoras tikras bayis l'sukkah. We'll say the converting of a house ceiling / roof into a sukkah. So, as we mentioned before, we have picture 208, that is, in front of us, and we continue with the Gemara itself. The Mishnah at the top line, Tikros she'ein oleh ma'aziva, a ceiling that does not have any ma'aziva. We'll say that's a cement covering. So you have just rafters. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now we will see here a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Berger. Rabbi Yehuda points out that the issue is a machlokes between earlier Tanoim, between Bashami and Beis Hillel. So Rabbi Yehuda quotes these earlier Tanoim. Bashami Omrim mefakpek v'noitel achas mi beintayim. Mefakpek means to move each board, to move it out of place and put it and reposition it. Rashi says, Soiser uminaneas kulan. That's Soiser is to undo and shake all of the boards. And in addition to that, Rabbi Yehuda's version of Beis Shammai has that he's noitel achas beintayim. He shall remove one board completely, and in its place he'll put standard schach material, branches. Let's say he'll place in that spot that he removed one of the boards altogether. Beis Hillel omrim mefakpek oy noitel achas mi beintayim. Beis Hillel says that you have a choice. You either move them or remove one of them. So the Gemara will have to explain why does Beis Shammai require two actions. Now on Beis Hillel, Rashi on the Mishnah says Beis Hillel omrim mefakpek. Rashi says mishum tasev lo mino asui. The reason for moving them is so that this would constitute a new making. By your picking up the board and then putting it down, that putting down is like a making anew of the sukkah, making it as a sukkah. The Ein Sorach Lo says Psal. Rashi points out that according to Beis Hillel, just move the boards. You don't have to add new schach. And as far as the boards themselves that were there originally as rafters, so you can imagine their standard building material. So Rashi adds, importantly, for Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei, Rabbi Yehuda here in allowing those kinds of boards to be used is consistent with what he has said in the past. The machshir b'nesorim sheish b'hem daled l'sakech es kula v'hainu karav. Rabbi Yehuda, and as far as Rav is concerned, we mentioned before that Rav and Shmuel had interpreted Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. So as far as Rav is concerned, Rabbi Yehuda, the Tana, would allow you to use boards of 4 tfachim for your entire sukkah. And the Gemara, Rashi says, Shmuel mitartzol l'kama. The Gemara, according to Shmuel, no one would allow you to use 4 tefach boards, so he'll have to explain the case here. We continue in the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir Omer, Noitel achas mi beintayim ve'eno mefakpek. Now, the Rashi explains, Rabbi Meir Omer, Noitel achas mi beintayim, avolo yefakpek. You must remove one of the boards and replace the space left with regular schach, and no moving of boards. She'ein pikpuk moyolel. The moving of the boards doesn't help. Rabbi Meir l'tamei domer ein mesachim b'nesorim. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Meir, that is, Rabbi Meir l'tamei. Rabbi Meir here is consistent with what he has said elsewhere, that says you're not allowed to use nesorim. And we alluded already to that, machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir earlier. The adei psal shebeintayim is kashra, and by the adding of the schach in the one board that you removed, that will make your sukkah kosher. In other words, you removed a board and you will add schach in that gap. That gap will have in it enough room for a kosher amount of schach. Let us turn back now to the Gemara. Rashi is elaborate here. He continues explaining things based on Gemaras later on. But for our purposes, we see a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah. Let's continue now with the Gemara. Bishlama Beis Hillel. We can understand Beis Hillel. He said you have a choice of moving the boards or removing one and replacing schach in that gap. So Beis Hillel is can be explained. Tamayu. Their reason is mishum tasev lemina osui, that the sukkah must be made initially as a sukkah, not something that was made as a house that you now want to use as a sukkah. So, in order to solve the problem of that's represented by ta'aseva lo min ha'asui and not min ha'asui, not something made as originally a house, imefakbek ovid le maisa. If you move all the boards, that's called a maisa. A maisa an action of construction that you're doing with sukkah intent. And when we say sukkah intent, by the way, we mean that you're building it as a sukkah as opposed to a house. I don't want to get into the problem of the fact that we've said in the past that you don't have to do it l'shem the mitzvah of sukkah, but you have to make it with the construction of a sukkah idea. Sukkah idea meaning a covering that's done for the purpose of creating shade, as opposed to a covering that you're putting on for the purpose of constructing a house. So by moving the boards and repositioning them, that is considered the maisa, the action required. Noitel achas liveintayim ovid ba maisa. Likewise, removing a board and replacing it with kosher schach is also considered the maisa that we are looking for. That you're doing a maisa, an action with the purpose of creating a sukkah. Ela Beis Shammai ma tamayu. But Beis Shammai, we have to understand what's the reason for what they say. They say in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda's version of Beis Shammai is you have to mafakbek and no talachas bein time. And on the side of the Gemara, under our mivneh heading, we have the double underline is featured, and you can see in the Gemara we have these double underlined expressions. They are shlavim lahasbir. They're stages in explaining divrei Beis Shammai alibud Rabbi Yehuda to try to understand Beis Shammai's as Rabbi Yehuda teaches it, the mefakpek v'noy talachas b'mein tayim, that he's expecting me to shake the boards and remove one altogether. Ha'im mishum tasev l'mina osui o mishum gzeras tikra. Is the consideration here to solve the problem of tasev l'mina osui, or is it to circumvent the problem or solve the problem of gzeras tikra? We mentioned Gzeras Tikra before, the use of boards that would confuse people with the possibility of sitting in their houses to begin with, for sukkahs. Ella, the Gemara continues, Ella Beis Shammai ma tamayu. Mishum ta'aseh v'lemin osui. If the issue is that we want you to engage in a ta'aseh, making of a sukkah, and not the use of something that was made as something else initially, so b'chada saki, one action would be enough, either mefakpek or notel achas b'bein tayim. Imishum gzeras tikra, if the concern is that we don't want you sitting under a sukkah, and again, this is derabanan, that on a rabbinic level we don't want you sitting under a covering, a schach covering made of standard building material. So benoitel achas mibein tayim saki, then it would be enough just to remove one of the boards that would be it would be wide enough that when I replace it with kosher schach, I would be then covered with an area of sufficient kosher schach to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. So if that is what is motivating Beis Shammai, we call the Gzeras Tikra, then benoitel achas mi bein tayim saki. Then removal of one board would be enough. Why does Beis Shammai require mefakpek also? The Gemara answers, Li'oilo mishum Gzeras Tikra. What is governing Beis Shammai is this concern, the rabbinic concern of Gzeras Tikra, v'hachi ko'amri, and thusly Beis Shammai is saying, Afapi shemefakpek, even if you shake the boards, and the shaking of the boards is designed, that would be designed to solve Tasev Ilmosi, but that's not what's bothering Beis Shammai. What's bothering Beis Shammai is a derabanan consideration, so even if you do mefakpek, only if you remove one of the boards completely, leaving enough space to fill in with kosher schach, then in means you fulfill your obligation, and if not, then you haven't fulfilled your obligation. So at this point, Beis Shammai doesn't really expect you to do two things. Beis Shammai is saying something completely different. He's saying even if you do mefakpek, that doesn't solve the problem that's bothering us. What's bothering us is the Gzeras Tikra, and that is solved only by Noitel Achas Bibein Tayim. The Gemara continues, if that is the pshat, so then go on with the seifa, and it says in the seifa, Rabbi Meir Omer, Noitel Achas Bibein Tayim, Avolo Yefakpek. Rabbi Meir says the only thing that helps a structure that was built originally as a house is the removal of achas mibein tayim, the removal of boards, replacing them with with kosher schach. So what's Rabbi Meir saying? Only one action, and it is specifically noitel achas mibein tayim. How did we just explain Beis Shammai? Only one action. It's got to be noitel achas mibein tayim. Notice we underline the expression noitel achas mibein tayim here, and 2 lines above also. So, Rabbi Meir, Hainu Beis Shammai, is Rabbi Meir reflecting? Is he paskening? Is he ruling like Beis Shammai? We know that Beis Shammai is a shita of Tanoim that is generally speaking not accepted. So why would Rabbi Meir choose, Rabbi Meir being a later Tana, why would he choose to represent shitas Beis Shammai? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Meir is not representing Shitas Beis Shammai, rather, Hachi Kamar, thusly Rabbi Meir is saying, Lo yinechliku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel b'davar zeh. There is no machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel on this matter. Even Beis Hillel will agree with what I'm saying, that that you can't use Nesarim as your schach, and Pitpuk won't help. The Gemara asks, "My komash malon." So, what's the chiddush of this of this Mishnah? The Rabbi Meir is like Zeras Tikra of Rabbi Yehuda, less like Zeras Tikra. That Rabbi Meir, he holds from the Drabonon prohibition of using building material boards as your schach, and Rabbi Yehuda does not hold from that restriction. They, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, have already argued about this topic in the past. This non we had back on Daf Yud Daled. The Mishnah said, Mesachem Nisar of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir Oser. Rabbi Yehuda says you can use Nisara building standard construction boards for your schach, and Rabbi Meir does not allow you to use it. So the question is, what do I need a second Mishnah? Here, our Mishnah, to say the same thing in the same principle as was said already in the Mishnah, previous Mishnah, Daf Yud Daled. Well, the question has been asked. The structure, you can see triangles are used, and there's numbering along the side of the Gemara. On the side of in the margin, we've written under the Mivneh heading. The triangle represents a ma'akaf, because you will see as the Gemara goes on, there are inverted triangles as well. So the ma'akav with the triangle point facing up, shuvos la she'ila, these are answers to the question of v'ha ifligu ba chagazimna, the question of redundancy. Why do you have a second Mishnah seemingly telling me the same thing as the previous Mishnah? So the triangle, point facing up, represents attempts to answer that. The inverted triangle are kushios or dechios. They represent a challenge to whatever answer had been given. Matras hadiyun, the purpose of this discussion, lahasbir al ma medubar b'mishnasenu, what is our Mishnah talking about? Lior Hamishna Li'el Daf Yudalid, in light of the Mishnah on Daf Yudalid that says Mesachem b'Nisarim v'chulei Kedei Shelo Yeh Kfilus. The goal is that we want to avoid redundancy. So we have to explain what is the real purpose behind the Mishnah on Yudalid and the Mishnah over here. And as the Gemara goes on, you'll notice the term Seifa appearing from time to time, and that is a reference to our Mishnah in contrast with the Mishnah that was quoted here. We just read it in the frame Mesachem Nisarim, which is found earlier. That hence it's the Reisha, the earlier Mishnah. So now that the structure is laid out, we proceed with the answers, and this is the first triangle, and it's number 1. Omar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Reisha v'nesorim meshupin askinon. The Mishnah on Daf Yudalid that we just quoted 2 lines above is talking about smoothed boards. Umishum gzeras kelim nogu ba. Not as we suggested before, but this is a new pshat, and that is that the issue between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir concerned the use of smoothed boards. Maybe one, let's say Rabbi Meir says not to use them because if we use them, you'll end up using vessels. And vessels are not allowed to be used as schach. Vessels are a davar hamakabel tuma. And even if it happens to be a wooden vessel, but if it is something that's susceptible to receiving tuma, so it's not kosher as schach. And Rabbi Yehuda is not worried about that if I use smoothed boards, that I would come to use vessels as my schach. Let's take a look at the Rashi in the lower part of the narrow lines. Omer Reb Chia bar Abba, Reisha lav mishum gzeras tikra iflug. In the Mishnah on Daf Yudalid, their machlokes, iflug is a machlokes, their machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda is not concerning the gzeras tikra, the fear of my coming to think that I could sit in my house. Elo b'nesarim she'enon b'nei arba. Rather, it's talking about boards that are not 4 tvachim wide. Avo meshupin hein v'chalokim. They are smooth. They've been sanded down. Meshupin is sanded down, and chalokim are smooth. U'ru'uyin l'tashmish. And they have alternative uses. U'mishum gzeras kelim nogu ba lifsol aliba de Rabbi Meir. And according to Rabbi Meir, who does not allow the nesarim, we're talking about the smooth nesarim, even if they don't have a receptacle part to them, they are smooth, tuma, and they, as a result of being smooth wooden vessels without any receptacle section to them, gozar behu otu kelim hakabel tuma. Rabbi Meir says don't use them because if you use these kind of smooth, sanded down wooden boards, you might end up using actual vessels that are makabel tuma. Now, let's continue in the Gemara. The Gemara raises a question. You can see we have the inverted triangle, and a long question accompanies this. Ula Rabbi Yehuda Marav Diomar. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda Omar Rav, this is an Amora, the Amora Rav Yehuda quoting Rav, that says Sochacha b'chitzin, that if one used arrows, as in the context of bow and arrow, if he used an arrow to cover his schach, and we've learned this before, there are 2 parts to an arrow. There's the zechorim, that's call it the handle of the arrow, the stem of the arrow, and that doesn't. It's a smooth, non-receptacle section of the arrow is good for schach b'nekevos psula. If however it's the tip of the arrow that is, maybe it's made of wood, but it also has a receptacle. The handle is inserted into the nekevos, so that's unfit. So we see the Amora, Rav Yehuda Marav, that says you can use chitzim zechorim. Now they're fashioned, it's smooth, it's wood, smoothed into the handle of the arrow, or the stem of the arrow. The logos are zechorim otu nekevos, and he does not impose a gezerah. Hachanami, so too over here. Lo nigzor nisorim mishupen otu kelim. There should be no grounds for making a gezerah, restriction on smooth boards in anticipation of coming to use actual vessels. So we see from the Amora standpoint, and the Amoroim knew what the Tanoim hold, and nevertheless Rabbi Yehuda Amarav says you can use the Zechorim, and there's no gezerah that he makes in anticipation of using something else that's not acceptable. Therefore, the explanation of the Mishnah Daf Yudalit cannot be as Reb Chia bar Avam Rab Yochanan suggested. Ela al korchoch reisha pligi b'gzeras tikra, the seifa pligi b'gzeras tikra. We're going to have to go back to what we suggested earlier, that the Mishnah on Daf Yudalid was a concern of tikra, and our Mishnah over here seems to be that is the machlokes. Then the redundancy question comes back again. What do I need to have this machlokes twice for? The Gemara answers, Seifa, our Mishnah here is not a repeat of the machlokes, but rather it is as follows. Notice there's a long answer marking. Seifa, Rabbi Yehuda, de Ka'omar le Rabbi Meir. The Seifa is Rabbi Yehuda addressing Rabbi Meir as follows: Amai ko asris b'nesorim? Why on Daf Yudalid did you aser prohibit using the boards? Mishum gzeras tikra. What concerned you is the fear of people thinking they could sit in their houses. Hi svara leBeishamai hu de islahu uBeis Hillel lo gazri. That analysis is a Bashami type analysis. Why do you say that? Why do you reflect that? Beis Hillel doesn't make the gezerah. The Omar Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir's response to that is Loi nechliku Beis Shammai u Beis Hillel bedavar zeh. There is no machlokes between them on this point. In other words, Beis Hillel also agrees that there is a gzeras tikra. Question. Notice you'll see this is a long question here. Hanicha l'Rav. Well, this analysis will fit into the scheme of things as far as Rav is concerned. The Omar machlokes b'sheish bein arba. That the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda concerns boards that have 4 tvachim to them. The Rabbi Meir islu gzeras tikra, Rabbi Yehuda less like gzeras tikra. Rabbi Meir, by preventing the use of boards 4 tvachim wide, reflects this fear, what we call gzeras tikra, and Rabbi Yehuda allows you to use 4 tefach wide boards, therefore not holding from gzeras tikra. Again, I know we're sounding a bit repetitious, but it's a somewhat abstract point. And Rabbi Yehuda, by saying you can use 4 tefach wide boards, he's not afraid, he's not fearful that people are going to confuse the sitting in the sukkah with remaining in one's house. Elo l'shmuel di Omar b'she'ein bohen arba machlokes avol yesh bohen arba divrei hakoil psula. Shmuel, in analyzing the machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, this is all chazorah for us. We've learned this before. And Shmuel holds that only boards less than 4 do you find a machlokes. But if there are actual 4 tefach wide boards, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees you cannot use it. So, according to Shmuel, to suggest that that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing concerning Zeras Tikra, that's not reasonable. Therefore, Seifa b'mai pliki. What is the Seifa coming to Mechadesh. Now, if we look in the Rashi on the second line under the Gemara text, toward the end of the line, Seifa b'may pligi ha vadai stam tikra, a standard tikra. Our Mishnah opened with the word tikra. Tikra is a ceiling. Your standard ceiling, a house ceiling, is b'nei arba hu, is a 4 tefach wide board. Because machshir Rebbe Yehuda aliba to Beis Hillel, and here Rebbe Yehuda is saying you're allowed to use a 4 tefach wide board. So according to Shmuel, who in the previous Mishnah, when you saw Rebbe Meir and Yehuda arguing about, it's quoted here, the Mishnah we quoted almost halfway down with the frame section Mesachim Nesorim, as far as Shmuel was concerned, that whole machlokes concerns boards between 3 and 4 tvachim of width. But 4 tvachim wide boards, even Rebbe Yehuda says you cannot use them. Our Mishnah, though, is talking about 4 tefach wide boards, and Rebbe Yehuda, according to Beis Hillel, is saying you're allowed to use them. So what's going on? So what's the machlokes in our Mishnah? The Gemara answers, true, our Mishnah is talking about 4 tefach wide boards. However, and you'll ask, so then how could someone machshir that? Because here the question is something new. Bebitule tikra kol mifliki. Their machlokes, Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Meir, are arguing about how do you undo a pre-existing roof. In other words, what's our goal over here? Our goal is to convert a house roof where the cement has been peeled away, to convert that into a sukkah covering. Bitule is the neutralizing or the voiding of that which was previously a tikra. How do you do that? Well, that's the machlokes. More savar betela b'hachi, or more savar b'hachi lo betela. According to Rebbe Yehuda, mefakpek, according to Beis Hillel, mefakpek works, and according to Rebbe Meir, mefakpek does not work. Now Rashi adds quite a bit more to this, puts everything in perspective. We have to summarize or review that which we saw on Daf Yudalid, the Mishnah Masam Nisar de Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Meir says Oser, where we were saying that their machlokes was concerning boards that were less than 4 tvachim. That had to do with initial use of boards, putting boards on as a sukkah covering, versus our Mishnah here that was speaking about a pre-existing ceiling or roof that you want to mevatel, you want to neutralize and void its initial identity and convert it into a sukkah, where the machlokes concerns 4 tefach boards. What's interesting to note is that when you're dealing with bituli tikra, even Rebbe Meir is allowing you at the end of the day to have 4 tefach boards over your head. The question that we have to look into, and Rashi will deal with this, is, well, why? Why, if Rebbe Meir, who is so restrictive, not only Rebbe Meir and Rebbe Yehuda, according to Shmuel, were so restrictive with the use of 4 tefach wide boards, how is it that in our Mishnah, at the end of the day, you are going to have 4 tefach wide boards over your head? So Rashi explains. And we'll look at Rashi on the 3rd wide line under the Gemara text, in the middle of the line, B'Betuli Tikra. Klomar, Omar Loch Shmuel, Li'olam B'Shiesh Ben Arba. Yes, I acknowledge in our Mishnah, we're talking about 4 tefach wide boards. V'lo hoisakan Tikra mitchila. V'achshav hu bo l'sachich b'hu l'shem sukkah. If it were a case where there were no ceiling ahead of time, and I'm now coming initially to make a sukkah covering, then afilu Rabbi Yehuda posil. Even Rabbi Yehuda will forbid using 4 tefach wide boards. The gazrinon mishum tikra. We impose a rabbinic restriction in anticipation of someone confusing the sitting in a sukkah with sitting in a house. Sholo Yovo v'yeshev tachas koros beso, that he shouldn't come to continue sitting in his house on the holiday of Sukkot, v'yomar, and claim mali zeh mali chadosha. What difference does it make whether I am sitting in this or I'm sitting in a new roof that I made with 4 tefach wide boards? It's the same material. That is the case of making a sukkah with 4 tefach wide boards. Avo. Hashta. Dezu tikra hoisa. In our case, this might sound ironic, but here, where you had an actual roof of a house, ubali de maisilasos l'shem sukkah, and our subject, our party here, the owner, is coming to make what was his house into a sukkah. The fact that he's going out of his way to do an action shows us that he knows the law of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, that he knows he can't continue sitting in that which was made initially as a non-sukkah. It has to be made as a sukkah. So he knows that. Pligi Rabbi Yehuda of Rabbi Meir, ikosula migzar mishum tikrolo. The machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir is concerning a person who demonstrates a certain level of knowledge. He demonstrates that he knows the law of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui. Do we have to impose upon him an additional gzeira of, we call gzeiras tikra? Rabbi Yehuda savar bituli tikra. L'Bashami, as far as Rabbi Yehuda is concerned, that the undoing of a roof, as according to Bashami, tzorch litol mi beintayim, you have to remove a board. Even though he shows us that he is expert or knowledgeable in the rules of ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, gazri ba. Rabbi Shammai we still make a gzeira. The gzeira of, we'll call it gzeiras tikra, and that will be manifest by total removal of boards and replacing regular schach in its place. Ubeis Hillel Savri Kevon de Botla. Beis Hillel tells us that since he was mavatel, since he voided the roof, and he shows us that a standard tikra is unfit. In other words, a real tikra is unfit. So we're dealing with a person that's aware that a real tikra is unfit. Sulekol mixer. There's no basis for imposing any additional gzeros. We're dealing with a person that isn't ever going to come to sit in his house as a sukkah. So we can allow the 4 tefach boards to remain over his head, provided he was mifakpek, he moved them, or notalachas beintayim. For Rabbi Meir Savar lo nechleku the af bo gazrinan. Rabbi Meir holds that there is no machlokes Bashami Silo, and that even in this case, where he did an action to show us that he is aware that you cannot sit in a house, we nevertheless impose an additional gzeira and insist that, and the Rabbi Meir's chiddush is that even Beis Hillel insists on the removal of a couple boards completely and replacing that spot with schach. As we approach the new Mishnah, we can take a look at a couple of illustrations. On page 42 in the Pirush Chai, the bottom, you see an illustration 210. This is a shpud. It's a spit that's used for roasting meat, and it is made of metal. In and of itself, being that it's made of metal, doesn't grow from the ground, so it's not something that is acceptable for schach purposes. Another picture, you see 211, you see what appears as a bed frame. What we want to focus, though, on is what's marked beis. It's called arukos hamita. It's the slat that forms the length of the bed. In fact, you can see another illustration of this on page 44 in the middle picture 221. the arukos hamita are not acceptable for schach use either. The Gemara will have to analyze what exactly is the problem with the arukos hamita. Let us turn to the Mishnah though itself. Hamekora sukasei, one who mekora is to cover his sukkah b'shpudim o b'arukos hamita, using what we saw in the illustrations 2:10 and 2:11. Im yesh revach beineim kemoison kshera. If the cover of the sukkah has these materials, and between, let us say, between each shpud, there is a gap that has the same width as that shpud. Or if he's using arukos hamita, the slats that form the bed length, and he places them on his sukkah. Between each one is a gap the same width as the arukos hamita, and he's going to fill in the gaps with kosher schach. So our Mishnah rules kshera. The Mishnah goes on with another halacha that's seemingly unrelated. It's just a new halacha. We've seen this halacha before. Illustration 214. Hachoitet begodish lasos loy sukkah eino sukkah. If one hollows out a heap of straw and forms a hollow that he thinks to use as a sukkah, so it's not going to be a good sukkah. Now, this section of the Mishnah we discussed already at length back on Daf Yud Beis, and we pointed out that the problem of chotet begodish is what we call ta'aseh velo min ha'asui. In that case where you had a totally solid heap of stalks that you hollowed out, the schach, the covering, was never placed on it as a covering. It was a solid mass that you just hollowed out. So there was no placing on top of the roof. There was no roof to speak of when you began the hollowing out. And so in the process of hollowing out, the roof developed automatically on its own without an action of placing a covering on top. The topic heading that we have on the side of the Gemara, the Nosei, two topics or two concepts are going to be mentioned. Porutz ka'omed. Porutz ka'omed is a concept that you find in Hilchis Shabbos when you're dealing with enclosures. If you look back at picture 105, that involves turning back to page 23 of the Pirush Chai, illustration 105, you can see a fence that is surrounding an area. The standing material is equal to the gaps, or you can say the gaps are equal to the area that is standing. That's called porutz ka'omed. Is that considered a sufficient enclosure as far as walls are concerned? So that is a concept that, as we mentioned, you find in Hilchos Shabbos when it comes to enclosures, and we're adopting that concept to our schach covering, where you have an equal amount of kosher versus unkosher. In the case of the enclosure, so the gap is, we'll call the equivalent of the unkosher, and the standing fence in the picture 105 is the equivalent of the kosher. So what happens when you have an equal amount of each one? Generally speaking, where you have, let's say, the majority of whatever. So when you have the majority of something being kosher, so we say you go bust a rove, the rove is kosher, so it's kosher. What about when it's equal? And another concept that we're going to see is efshur litzamtzem. Efshur litzamtzem has to do with being exact. Litzamtzem is to be precise or exact. Now the Gemara. Leimo teheve tiyufta de Rav Huna bre Rav Yeshua. shall we say that our Mishnah represents a refutation of Rav Huna's din, the Itmar? It has been stated regarding fence enclosures on Shabbos, in order to create a private domain in Shabbos terms, you have to have an enclosed area. So it says regarding that topic, porutz ka'omed, where the breaches. Notice the word porutz. If you look at it phonetically and you have a good imagination, you can see the word porutz and the word breach. As far as the articulation, the letter articulation of these two words, they're almost identical. Porutz and breach. So the porutz ka'omed, where the breaches are the same as that which is standing. Rav Papa Amar Muter, Rav Huna Braid Rav Yeshua Amar Aser. Now with the markings you can see easily how we highlighted Rav Huna's Aser versus the Mishnah saying Kshera under similar circumstances. Of equal, kosher and non-kosher, Mishnah says okay, Rav Huna says not okay. So is our Mishnah, which is a Mishnah obviously, a refutation of the Amoraic position taken by Rav Huna Braid Yeshua? Amar Lach Rav Huna Braid Yeshua. He answers, my kemoison. What does the term kemoison, which you see in the Mishnah, we have a little arrow to the side of the Gemara text, you can see where the line in which that appeared. What does kemoson mean? When the Mishnah says, Im yesh rev avenim kemoson, benichnas v'yotzei. The Rashi, on the second line from the bottom, benichnas v'yotzei, she psal haroichev kemoson. The psal is a word meaning schach. The schach that the Mishnah alludes to when it speaks about the revach b'neim, that's you're going to put schach in there. It's a gap, it's a space she'psal harochav kimoison, where the schach that has the same width as, let's say, the arukos hamita. So if the arukos hamita are 5 inches wide, the schach that is 5 inches wide, you'll be able to slip in and out the schach, slip it in and out of that gap easily. So how wide is that gap in actuality? For avir yoiser al ashpudim. Technically speaking, then, if the width of the puzzle material, the shpudim or the arukas amita, we're just being repetitive now. If the width of those items, the puzzle items, is 5 inches, it's an arbitrary number. And I take schach, kosher schach, 5 inches wide. The gap described in our Mishnah, the gap on top is such that I'll be able to slip in and out a 5-inch section of kosher schach very easily, meaning without moving without it touching that which is on either side. So in actuality, how wide is that gap? That gap is a little bit wider than the arukos hamita or the shpudim. Now, in that gap, I'm not going to put schach the same width as the arukas amita, but in actuality, the gap will be filled with kosher schach. So in actuality, there is a majority of kosher schach on the sukkah top. What we said, I hope, is clear. There is a room for someone being a little confused, so we'll go over this point again at the expense of sounding overly repetitious. But the Rashi made the point that there's the theoretical and then there's the actual. The theoretical is the gaps on the top of the sukkah described here are such that in theory, if I had schach the same width as the puzzle material, that same width material, I would be able to slip in and out of the actual gaps easily. Now, in actuality, I'm going to fill those gaps completely with kosher schach. So at the end of the day, the sukkah is covered majority with kosher schach. The Gemara asks at the top of Amud Beis, V'ha efshar letzamtzem, and here the question is very brief, but we have to learn the Rashi in order to appreciate the question. The Rashi at the top, V'ha efshar letzamtzem, kol salka daitoch. The thinking is, the high de komentaris b'nichos v'yotzei, the answer the Gemara gave of easily in and out, the ability to slip the schach easily in and out of the gap, hachi mitaretz, the thinking, the havamina, salkadach is just an initial stage of thinking, and that's the stage we're holding by right now. That the term nichnas v'yotzei that the Gemara introduced is explaining, it's trying to say as follows: kol kamoso, wherever you see the word kamoso, wherever you see that word, benichnas v'yotzehu, that kamoso really means that the gap is a little bit wider than the puzzle material. Stama hu benichnas v'yotzei, where you see the word kamoso, it is benichnas v'yotzei, that in general, it's assumed stamahu b'nichnas v'yotzei the ein derech litzamtzem. It's not the way of people to be so exacting, ulechavein, and to aim and knowingly be precise. Kamoisen mamish lo bochos v'leyoser. So when the Gemara answered that the Mishnah says b'nichnas v'yotzei, the Mishnah was saying that, well, when you see the word kamoson, you can assume that the gap is b'nichnas v'yotzei uparchina. And then our Gemara here at the top asks, what would be if a person actually concentrates? Could he not have an exact gap the same size as the puzzle material? The Mishnah says when it's the same size, when the gap is the same size as the kosher schach, as the puzzle schach, when the gap which will be filled by kosher schach is the same exact size, the havilei porotz ka'omei, and that would be a case where the breach is the same as that which is standing, and the Mishnah rules it's kosher, and that would not be like Rav Huna Breder of Yeshua. So the Mishnah, the question comes around again. Granted, if you're not concentrating, so the gap will likely be greater than the puzzle schach material. However, if you concentrate, could you not create a gap the same size as the puzzle schach material? And the Mishnah says that it will be kosher when you fill the exact same size gap with kosher schach. Is that not a refutation of Rav Huna? Omar Rabbi Ami. You see diamonds here, and on the side, under the Mivneh heading, we've explained these are Shnei Tshuvos Avur Rav Huna Rav Yeshua. These are two explanations that defend Rav Huna. Shama Poros Komed Posel. He, Rav Huna, had said Poros Komed is Posel. Kedei Shelo Yeh Mishnasenu Tufta. We don't want our Mishnah to be a refutation of Rav Huna. So how do we defend Rav Huna? Omar Rabbi Ami. Gemara at the top line. Rabbi Ami says, B'ma'adif. Very simple. Ma'adif means extra. Our Mishnah is not machshir the case of mitzamtzem. Not like we thought, as we saw in the Rashi 2 lines above. But the Mishnah, when it says in Yesh Revach B'neim Kamoison, it means that the Revach is made a bit wider than the actual puzzle schach that's there. If we look in the Rashi on the first narrow line, Umeshani Omer Rabbi Ami b'ma'adif masnisin lo achshe b'mitzamtzem. Our Mishnah is not allowing exact gaps, exact in width to the puzzle schach. Ela b'ma'adif revach shebein hayim al harochav hashpudim. The Mishnah is saying only if the gap is a bit wider. Ukemoisam dekotani hacha. The word kemosan that appears here in our Mishnah, kemosan means like it. It means b'nichnas v'yotze. So that according to Rav Ami, the Mishnah is saying if the revach is the same size as the posel schach, it means it's the same size as schach, having the same width as the posel schach, and your ability to slip it in and out easily. Rava Omar, afilu tema b'she'ein madif. Rava goes further. He says, you know what? You could be mitzamtzem. You could be exact. Have your gaps exactly the same width as the existing posel schach. And still, at the end of the day, I will have more kosher schach on top. So Rava says, even if you say, afilu temo b'she'ein madif, im hoyu nesunim shti, nosun orev. Orev, noisnon shti. The term shti and orev means crisscross, or at 90-degree angles. Now, to appreciate this, we have illustrations. Let's look at illustration 219. This you'll find on page 44. Looking carefully at illustration 219. So the gaps, and you have aleph. The aleph represents called the arukos hamita, or shpudim. It's the unkosher schach, what's noted in aleph. So they're running in the length of the sukkah. A gap between each board, each unfit board. If the unfit boards, if the arukos hamita are 5 inches wide, the gaps are exactly 5 inches wide. However, you can see that the boards are running in the length of the sukkah. I'm going to put kosher schach perpendicular to those boards. Now, how are they going to be able to be supported on top of the boards? The length of the kosher schach, the length of those slats that you're going to place on top of the sukkah, perpendicular to the unkosher boards, their length is going to be greater than the width of the gaps. So that in the final analysis, there's more kosher schach than just the width of the gaps. It's the ends that are laying atop the arukos hamita. So that all told, there is more kosher schach overhead than unkosher schach. The gaps themselves represent the width of the unkosher schach. But in order to fill up the gaps, I have to have the slats that are going to be perpendicular to those boards running in the length. They're going to have to be a bit longer than the width of the existing gaps. And as a result, the majority of the sukkah is covered with kosher schach. The Gemara continues, Oy barukos hamita. Our Mishnah said that it's not acceptable unless there is a revach b'neim kemoisan. So arukos hamita are basically unkosher in and of themselves as schach. Lema misayea le Rab Ami bar Tevumi. Can we say that our Mishnah supports Rav Ami's teaching? And in order to appreciate this, we look at illustration 220. In that illustration, we see a sukkah that's covered with fabric. They're called bloi kalim, worn out fabric. Sochacha, our Gemara says, Yomer of Ami bar Tevumi, Sochacha bevloi kalim, psula. Even bloi kalim are worn out articles of clothing that even though they're not fit for anything, they are unfit for schach because their origin is a vessel. They come from vessels. They come from actual clothing or actual material. So the emphasis here is on the fact that it originated as a kli. Even though right now it's not functional, it's not mekabel tuma, Nevertheless, since they originated from actual kelim, actual vessels, or actual items that were makabel tuma, so even the remnants of such are unfit. What's the connection to our topic? So we said that our Mishnah, which says the slats of a bed, we'll call it like the remnants of a bed, are also unkosher for schach. The assumption being that the remnants of the bed themselves are not fit for being makabel tuma, but since they came from an original vessel, they cannot be used as schach. So our Mishnah would seem to support Rav Ami bar Tivumi. The Gemara responds, no support. Kid Omar Rav Chonon Omar Rebbe. Rav Chonon, in the name of Rebbe, says that the case of the Mishnah is illustrated in picture 221. Ba'aruka ushtei krayim. Shtei krayim are and its two legs. Picture 222. B'ktsora ushtei krayim, or the slat that represented the width of the bed and its two legs. That is what the Mishnah is talking about, and not just the slat themselves, but it's the slats with the legs. Hachanami, so too, as Rav Chonon said over there where he spoke, he said the slats include the two legs. Hachanami, so too in our Mishnah, Shtei krayim, B'ktsora shtei krayim. Our Mishnah is also talking about circumstances like that. The aruka has two legs. The kitsara, the narrow slat, the narrow part that represented the width of the bed, also we're speaking about a case where it had its two legs. Now, as such, they are right now fit for use. They have a functional value, not just that they originated from a vessel, but they currently have a functional value. And what that is, the Gemara will explain. Heicha itmar de Rav Chonon Omar Rebbe. Where did Rav Chonon speak up? The Gemara, he was quoting him. So what was the origin of his comment? Aha Disnan, based on the following. So we continue at the top of Tez Zayin Amud Aleph. The Tanaic source speaks about a bed that became tomei, and how are you to immerse it in a mikveh. Mita mitamis chavila mitaris chavila divrei Rabbi Eliezer. A bed is capable of being makabel tuma if it's chavila. Chavila means it is complete. Rashi at the top says chavila means biyachad, mitaris chavila, im tmeahi ein tvila oila lo evorim. To the immersion does not help if it's in only in sections. Ela misakna umabila. You have to put it together in all its component parts and toivel it as a whole complete entity. So our Mishnah says that the mita is makabel tuma if it's chavila, if it's together. Mitaheres chavila, divrei Rebbe Eliezer. That's Rebbe Eliezer's opinion, that it has to be immersed in a mikveh. If it became tamei all at once. V'chachamim omrim mitames evorim umitaheres evorim. Evorim is a reference, means literally limbs. What are the limbs of a bed? Omar Rav Chonon Omar Rebbe, Aruko Shtei Krayim, Ktsoro Shtei Krayim. The length, the slat that forms the length and its two legs, or the slat that forms its width and its two legs. Lemai Chazio, well, what practical value does a slat with two legs have on it? The Gemara answers, Lemismechinu Aguda, picture 223, Ulemesev Alayu Umajda Ashli. The aruka can be attached with two perpendicular rods, and apparently that is not that's not considered as if the original board with its two legs was lacking something of significance. It's considered a minor say action of bringing these perpendicular boards and inserting it into the Arukas Hamita. But you can see in 223 what he's done. He's going to use a low wall and the existing two legs of the long slat, forming a new unit of which you could conceivably sit on that, use it as a bench or a bed even. So the Arukos Ushtei Kraim have current value as a vessel. And that's what the Gemara means when it says the Mismechin was to lie it aguda on a wall, on a low wall, ulemesiv alayon, to sit on them, umishta ashli. Let's see Rashi on the fourth line from the top, umishta ashli, v'nosen chavolem umesareg uruuyo lemishgav umetame medris. It can be threaded, if you will. You can see this is what you see in picture 223, that making that netting that he's made by weaving ropes across this entity creates that situation, and it's thereby fit for sitting, and it's subject to Kabbalah's Tumah if a medris would sit on it. A medris person who experienced the type of bodily release, he becomes Tomei, and if he sits on vessels, they will be Makabal Tumah. So we're demonstrating by that point that this is now something subject to Kabbalah's Tumah. Hence, we saw that you cannot use Arukos Ushtei Krayim, you cannot use that as Schach. Before we conclude, let us remind you that if you wish to be in touch with us, we can be reached at gmarkings@gmail.com. With that, we conclude our Shiur for today.